For most of us, the concept of a city-leveling explosion belongs to the atomic age. We think of the desert sands of New Mexico or the tragic skyline of Hiroshima. But nearly 30 years before the world learned the name Oppenheimer, the most powerful man-made explosion in human history occurred on a quiet Thursday morning in a Canadian port city. It was an event so violent it literally evaporated the water of the harbor, sent a tidal wave crashing through the streets, and was felt hundreds of miles away. This is the story of the Halifax Explosion, a catastrophe born of wartime haste, a series of tragic misunderstandings, and a floating bomb that no one saw coming until it was too late. December 1917 found Halifax, Nova Scotia, at the height of its importance. The Great War was raging in Europe, and this deep-water port was the primary jumping-off point for the Allied war effort. The harbor was a chaotic bottleneck of activity, filled with troop ships, hospital ships, and freighters carrying the lifeblood of the front lines. Food, lumber, and most importantly, explosives. Because of the constant threat of German U-boats, ships gathered here to form convoys, protected by the safety of the British Navy. On December 5th, 2 ships arrived that would soon cross paths in the worst way imaginable. The first was the SS Mont-Blanc, a French cargo ship. It was not a particularly large vessel, but it was perhaps the most dangerous ship in the Atlantic. Its hull was packed to the brim with over 2,500 tons of high explosives, including TNT, picric acid, and highly flammable benzol fuel stored in barrels on the deck. It was quite literally a floating powder keg. The second ship was the SS Imo, a Norwegian vessel bound for New York to pick up relief supplies for the war-torn citizens of Belgium. The Imo was in a hurry. It had been delayed in the harbor, and its captain was eager to make up for lost time. The morning of December 6th was clear and bright. At approximately 8:45 a.m., the Mont Blanc began its slow crawl into the harbor, headed toward the inner basin. At the same time, the Imo was heading out. They were navigating a narrow strait known as the Narrows. In the world of maritime travel, there are strict rules for passing, much like driving on a road. But a series of confusing whistles and misunderstood maneuvers led both ships into the same lane. As they drew closer, the crews realized the danger. Engines were reversed, but the momentum of the massive steel vessels was unstoppable. At a speed barely faster than a human walk, the Imo's bow crunched into the starboard side of the Mont Blanc. To a casual observer on the shore, the collision didn't look like a disaster. It was a slow-motion grinding of metal. But inside the Mont Blanc, the damage was catastrophic. The collision knocked over the barrels of benzol on the deck, which immediately began to leak into the hold, mixing with the explosives below. As the Imo backed away, the friction of the metal hulls created a shower of sparks. In seconds, the Mont Blanc was ablaze. Knowing their ship was a ticking time bomb, the French captain ordered his crew to abandon ship. They rowed frantically for the opposite shore, screaming warnings in French that the English-speaking locals couldn't understand. For 20 minutes, the Mont Blanc drifted toward the city's busiest piers, burning with a terrifying intensity. A massive column of black, oily smoke rose into the sky. It was a spectacle. Thousands of people stopped what they were doing to watch. Children on their way to school gathered at the water's edge. Workers in factories leaned out of windows. They had no way of knowing they were staring into the face of death. Amidst this looming doom, a lone figure remained at his post. Vincent Coleman was a railway telegraph dispatcher at the North Street station, just hundreds of yards from the burning ship. He had been warned of the danger and began to run for his life, but then he remembered something. A passenger train from St. John, New Brunswick, was due to arrive in minutes with hundreds of people on board. Coleman turned back, sat at his desk, and tapped out a final message. "Hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbor making for Pier 6 and will explode. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys." His warning reached the train in time, saving 300 lives. It was indeed his last message. At 9:04 and 35 seconds a.m., the Mont-Blanc vanished. The explosion was instantaneous and absolute. The temperature at the center of the blast rose to 5,000 degrees Celsius. The pressure wave moved at more than 3,000 feet per second, flattening everything in a 2-kilometer radius. The Richmond district, a bustling working-class neighborhood, was simply wiped off the map. Homes, churches, and factories were reduced to splinters and dust in less than a second. The physical power of the blast was staggering. The Mont-Blanc's forward gun barrel was found 3 miles away. An anchor fluke weighing half a ton landed 2 miles in the opposite direction. The shockwave shattered windows 100 miles away and was heard as far off as Prince Edward Island. But the blast was only the beginning. The explosion displaced so much water that the harbor floor was briefly exposed before a massive 18-meter tsunami surged inward, sweeping survivors and wreckage back into the icy Atlantic. For those who survived the initial blast, the world had turned into a nightmare. Over 1,600 people died instantly, and the death toll would eventually climb to over 2,000. 9,000 more were injured. One of the most horrific aspects of the disaster was the epidemic of blindness. Because so many people had been watching the fire through their windows, the blast wave shattered the glass directly into their faces. Surgeons would spend the next several days performing hundreds of eye removals, a trauma that would haunt the medical community for decades. As the smoke cleared, a new horror arrived. The following morning, one of the worst blizzards in the region's history slammed into Halifax. 16 inches of snow buried the survivors who were trapped under the rubble of their homes. Relief efforts were paralyzed as trains were blocked and rescuers struggled to find the living in the freezing whiteout. It was a double tragedy, a fire and ice apocalypse that tested the very limits of human endurance. Yet in the darkness, the world responded. Despite the war, aid poured in from across North America. The most significant help came from the city of Boston. Upon hearing the news, the authorities in Massachusetts organized a relief train packed with doctors, nurses, and supplies, which fought through the blizzard to reach the stricken city. The bond formed between Halifax and Boston in those freezing, blood-stained days remains unbroken to this day. Every year, as a token of eternal gratitude, the province of Nova Scotia sends a massive evergreen tree to the city of Boston to serve as their official Christmas tree. The Halifax Explosion remains a somber milestone in history. It changed the way we understand blast physics, it revolutionized emergency medicine, and it led to new international regulations for maritime safety. But beyond the statistics and the science, it is a story of human moments. The self-sacrifice of Vince Coleman, the courage of the nurses who worked through the night in the dark, and the resilience of a city that refused to stay broken. Today, if you walk through the Richmond district of Halifax, you will see a modern, vibrant community. But if you look closely at the foundations of the older buildings or visit the memorial bells that ring out every December 6th, you can still feel the echoes of that Tuesday morning. We remember Halifax not just for the magnitude of its destruction, but for the strength of the spirit that rose from its ashes. It serves as a reminder that even in our darkest hours, when the very sky seems to fall, the best of humanity, our courage, our compassion, and our willingness to help a stranger, will always be the light that leads us home.